We're starting here at Cooke Memorial Park. John Cooke arrived on the Mayflower with his father Francis in 1620. He was 13 years old. And John Cooke in 1653 was one of the 36 Plymouth colonists who purchased all of this territory that we're now standing on from Chief Massasoit. He was the only original Mayflower passenger to settle in the old Dartmouth territory, and he happened to settle in the northern part of what is now Fairhaven. He was a very prominent man. He was elected as a representative to Plymouth Court many years, served as a selectman even during the King Philip War, and he died here in town in 1695. He was the last surviving male pilgrim, and he was buried somewhere. In 1888, a lecturer who was a descendant of John Cooke was talking to the Improvement Association and said, "The bones of our pilgrim ancestor are probably buried in that old burial ground at Poverty Point." And so the Improvement Association, with nothing to back that up, put a rock in here with a plaque that says John Cooke was buried here. When William Wood wrote his will, he said there were some people that were buried somewhere in this burial ground. He doesn't mention who they were. In 1902, when they were grading this property to create this park and put this boulder here, they did uncover 4 bodies. 2 were children, 2 were adults. None were in any way identified whatsoever. So we don't know where John Cooke was buried. But John Cooke was an important person in our history, and we do know that this was a burial ground. We just don't know who was buried here. This is the Coggeshall Memorial House. Martha Coggeshall was from Fairhaven. She grew up here. Her uncles had this property. They were Jennies, and they lived in a little house here. Martha eventually got the property. Her husband was a businessman, so Martha and her husband lived out of town for a number of years, but in their older years, near the time of their retirement, they built this house here, 1908. Martha Coggeshall joined the Colonial Club when it was founded in 1912. Her husband died in 1914, and in 1916, Martha Coggeshall died herself. She left the house in trust so that the Colonial Club could use it as their meeting place and to house their collection. So the Colonial Club moved in here in 1916. It served as their museum. In 2016, the Colonial Club heard from Bank of America, who were now the trustees. They said, "The trust is out of money. We can't afford to pay the real estate taxes or keep up the house. You've got to move out." The Colonial Club did that. They had to sell off much of their collection. This is the James Allen House. It's a Federal style house. It was built about 1840, and it was the home of boat builder James Allen Sr. Boats were made here in his boatyard. So this is James Allen, one of 4 generations of Allen, and we'll see the original house later on. This one across the street is the David West House. It was built in 1768, Georgian-style house. Avery Parker built it. In 1777, that was owned by Benjamin Spooner. And during the Revolution, when the first naval battle of the American Revolution was fought in our outer harbor, Benjamin Spooner was the drummer for the militia company that was commanded by Nathaniel Pope and Daniel Eggery. It later went to David West. He bought the house after the war, and he had a slaughterhouse out in the back of it. They had homes, they had stores, they had slaughterhouses. You could live in the neighborhood and walk from place to place and get just about everything you needed. So this is one of the very early pre-revolutionary homes in this neighborhood. The next one, similar age. This was Salathiel Eldridge's house. He was the son of the guy who purchased this property and created the village here. This dates from 1763. This one also has fireplaces, some of the original glass is in here. It's a very beautiful example of a Georgian-style house. And then this one was the home of artist Charles Gifford. This was built in 1875. Gifford was a luminous painter. He studied under Fairhaven's William Bradford and the Dutch artist Van Beest, who worked at Bradford's studio as well. Gifford sold his first painting in 1865 for $10, and he opened up a studio in New York in the 1870s. Then he moved back up into here, and he opened his studio in the tower that was added on in 1897. He wrote about his studio here at Poverty Point. There is no other place on the New England coast that would give me material for study such as sunsets, moonlights, and storms. This is James Allen Jr. James Allen Jr. was the last of the Allen boat builders that lived here. This house dates from the 1830s to 40s. He later had a boatyard on Pope's Island. This place was originally known as the Little Village at the foot of William Wood's homestead. In 1760, from Cherry Street down was sold off, and this started to develop as a village. It got the name Oxford. Very prosperous. Shipbuilding went on here. Lots of business was happening here until in 1796, a group of people got together and they petitioned to build the first Fairhaven, New Bedford bridge. It was a stone structure that went all the way down to the bottom of the harbor like the hurricane barrier does. It had two small draws that didn't allow really big ships to travel this far up the river. So all of the business from Oxford ended up moving south across to the other side of the bridge. And this got left with the nickname Poverty Point. Before too long, it became a quite prosperous residential neighborhood. And so the Poverty Point time when it might have been in economic distress didn't last very long at all, but the nickname has lasted more than 200 years. On this lot was once the house of Peleg Huddlestone with an E. He was one of the earlier ancestors of Henry Huddleston Rogers, and he was a shipbuilder, and an early map shows his house right about here. There was a more modern house that was built here later, lived in by the San Juan family until February 16th, 1992. There was a big raging fire down here that destroyed the San Juan house, and Don Pedro San Juan, who was 40 years old, died in that blaze. His wife and 4 children survived, and this lot sat empty for a number of years. Around 1995, 1996, this house was built here, and it was originally used as a bed and breakfast. Now it's just a private home. This land was first owned by Thomas Tabor. He was a son-in-law of John Cooke. After Thomas Tabor died, the property was acquired by William Wood. Elnathan Eldridge built what is now this smaller part of this house around 1760. He was the guy who bought this property and divided it into house lots. Elnathan Pope ran a store out of here in the early days too. He had a pier here. He was engaged in trade with the West Indies. It was expanded in the 1870s, and it was called Edgewater by Clara Anthony, and it was a much more elaborate looking house. There are a couple of early photographs of it that show some very Victorian things. It had a little tower and a turret and so on, but hurricanes put an end to that, and it's a little more simplified looking now. From 1984 until 2006, Kathy Reed ran Edgewater Bed and Breakfast here. A lot of famous folks used to stay here. Patrick Stewart came to New Bedford to study for a few days at the Whaling Museum, and he stayed here. But now it's a private home, This one over here, built about 1770, was the Hiram Rand House. It's a 3/4 cape. Seth Toby lived in this house. He was a Revolutionary War veteran. He served in Daniel Eggery's company too. More famously, this was the home of Charles D. Waldron. And in 1879, Charles D. Waldron, right here in this house, started the Fairhaven Star newspaper. It was a weekly newspaper that ended up being published from 1879 until 1966. And then the Fairhaven Star had a few different homes in the center of town, but the newspaper started right here. We've got another early house right over here. This one built about 1790, and this was the Bartlett Allen house. This is where the beginning of the Allen boat builders were. Bartlett Allen was the second of 4 generations. His father, Eleazar Allen, started the boat building trade and then built this house here. Bartlett Allen lived in it, and then James Allen and James Allen Jr., whose homes we have seen. I've always loved this house because of the window in the front with all the little tiny panes of glass there. Now, the Allen family owned it into the 1840s, and when Manjiro Nakahama was in town, the sisters Jane and Charity Allen lived here, and Jane Allen taught at the Old Stone Schoolhouse, tutored Manjiro in English, and suggested that he might want to go to school at the schoolhouse. This house is on the Manjiro Trail. The next one is as well. This was the Aiken house, and several generations of the Aiken family lived here. Bartholomew Aiken, then Ebenezer Aiken Jr., and another Bartholomew Aiken. The Aikens were very prominent in Fairhaven history. Ebenezer Aiken was our first tax collector. Ebenezer Aiken Jr. was a friend of Captain William Whitfield. Captain Whitfield was at sea. He rescued this Japanese boy from the Pacific Ocean, came back to town, but he had to leave town for a few weeks, and so he left Manjiro to stay with the Aiken family. And that's when he was introduced to the Allens next door. Ebenezer Aiken was also a school committee man for about 50 years. So again, very interested in seeing that Manjiro be educated and learn English. These 2 houses were both owned by the Whitfield family. Captain William Whitfield grew up in this neighborhood. He was a whaling captain. When they were in the Pacific Ocean in 1841, they came across a little island. They sent some men ashore to look for fresh water, and they discovered 5 stranded Japanese fishermen who had been there 6 months. They were near death. They took the Japanese men on board. One of them was 13-year-old Manjiro Nakahama. So Captain Whitfield took Manjiro under his wing, treated him like a son, brought him back to Fairhaven, where in 1843, Manjiro became the first Japanese person ever to live in the United States. Manjiro lived in America for 10 years, and he eventually went to San Francisco during the gold rush. He made enough money in San Francisco to buy his passage back to Japan. When he got to Japan, Manjiro was thrown in prison. Japanese people were not supposed to leave Japan. However, Manjiro arrived at a relatively opportune time. Commodore Perry arrived in Japan in an attempt to get the Japanese to sign a trade agreement with the United States. Well, Manjiro was pulled out of prison, and he sort of served behind the scenes as an interpreter for the Japanese, and he is credited with helping convince the Japanese officials to sign the treaty with America. The house was put up for sale, and a very prominent Japanese doctor, Dr. Hinahara, he decided to start raising funds in Japan to purchase the Captain Whitfield house in Fairhaven. They donated it to the town of Fairhaven, and the nonprofit Whitfield Manjiro Friendship Society operates the museum there. This is the Seth Mitchell house. This was built in 1820. Seth Mitchell was a carpenter. He most likely built this house himself. It's a federal style building. In 1835, the chimney was struck by lightning. It actually killed the daughter, Desire Mitchell. Later, this was the boyhood home of former Fairhaven postmaster and state representative Eben Brown. Across the street is the Nicholas Tabor House, 1794. Nicholas Tabor owned lots of houses, a lot of ships. He was a sea captain, and he owned a public house and a share in a store in this area as well. That's a false front that's put on. That's not original to the building, but it is a center chimney, federal style house or late Georgian style house. This is the Solomon Williams house originally. We call it Solomon Williams / Everett S. Allen. It was built about 1799 by Solomon Williams, and he purchased the land from his neighbor, Nicholas Tabor, for $130. In 1901, Mrs. Sarah Leonard bought this house, and the Leonard sisters installed an elevator in this house. Later on, this became the home of Everett S. Allen. He was a journalist. He was an editor for the New Bedford Standard Times, and he wrote a number of important history books about the area. So Everett S. Allen ended up living here as well. Captain John Bunker House, built about 1790. Bunker was originally from Nantucket. This part of Oxford Street was once known as Bunker's Lane. He owned some of the property over here. And on North Street, Joseph Bates Jr. was living here most likely when he wrote the treatise Placing the Sabbath on the Seventh Day. So he was renting some rooms in the Bunker House at the time that was written. That's the Anselm Bourne, built about 1850. He was a carpenter, and he built a number of houses throughout the town. This is the Thomas Bennett Mansion, built about 1810. He was owner of a number of packet ships that he sailed from New York to Liverpool, and this was known as the most pretentious house in the village. The last Bennett to live here was Miss Clara Bennett. She died in 1928. The second stipulation in her will was that it be left to a historical organization. So the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities acquired this home. They operated it into the 1930s, maybe early 1940s, and they eventually sold the house, and it became split up into apartments. House across the street, Charles and Sophie Wilson House, built in 1902. The Gibbs family sold the lot to the Wilsons, and Charles Wilson built it. He was a carpenter, and from 1919 to 1927, he was the carpentry instructor for the New Bedford Vocational School. Kathy and Bud Potter lived there today. Kathy Potter was involved with the New Bedford Preservation Society for many, many years. This land was all owned by Thomas Tabor. After he died, his son Philip inherited it, and then it was bought by William Wood. The front part of this house was built by William Wood in 1742. This is the oldest house that I know of that's still standing intact in the town of Fairhaven. In 1793, it was purchased by Joseph Bates Sr. He came from Wareham. His son, Joseph Bates Jr., went to sea during the War of 1812 as a cabin boy. He was captured by the British and imprisoned at Dartmoor Prison. Later on, he sailed ships out of the harbor here and started becoming a follower of the Reverend William Miller. He had a date for the second coming of Christ. It was going to be March 21st, 1841. The date came and went, and Jesus hadn't arrived. He proposed a second date, and that came and went. And these people, the followers of Miller, became known as Second Adventists. They were waiting for the second advent of Christ. Well, Joseph Bates was a Second Adventist, and he was trying to figure out what went wrong. Joseph Bates realized that if we had been worshiping on the wrong day of the week for 2,000 years, that's what had thrown off the calculations. So he wrote a treatise proposing that the Sabbath be moved back to the seventh day, Saturday, and that was the founding principle of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now this house, after the Bates owned it, it was bought by the Hathaway family, and for the next 170 years, it belonged to descendants of the Hathaways. And the last one of those people was Genevieve Darden. She and her husband Hugh lived here, and every year when Seventh-day Adventists would come to Fairhaven on a pilgrimage to learn about the founding of their church, the Dardens welcomed Seventh-day Adventists to visit the house and walk around. Genevieve died just before her husband Hugh died. The family decided they were going to put it up for sale, and in 2005, the Adventist Heritage Ministry purchased the house, and they've been restoring it. It's about to open as a museum. Thomas Tabor, son-in-law of John Cooke, built a house here. And what you're looking at right there is part of the south wall of the house. It's called a stone ender. It's a Rhode Island style house. It went up to a big peak and a chimney over there with that huge 10-foot wide fireplace. And it was similar to the houses that you would see today reproduced at Plymouth Plantation. This is the remains of the Thomas Tabor fireplace, built about 1678. It's the oldest relic of anything that we have here in town. And John Cooke was still alive until 1695. So we're quite sure that John Cooke would have sat in front of this fireplace during his lifetime, one of the actual pilgrims right here on this property. I don't know why William Wood built his house only 2 feet away. That's one of the biggest mysteries of all time. This house remained in 1855 or so. There was a painting done, most likely by Amelia Hawes, and it shows an Indian woman standing in front of the house. Her name was Annis Sharper, passed away in the later 1850s, but she was one of the last people to live in this house. The wooden structure burnt down in the late 1800s, and the chimney stood until the very early 1900s when that collapsed as well. So that's a very, very interesting Fairhaven relic that we have here. This is the Captain Joshua Slocum plaque. Slocum had been a sea captain. He sailed all over the world during the height of the sailing days, but in the late 1880s, steamships were taking over. Sailing captains were not needed as much anymore. He was reaching retirement age, and so he was in Boston. He met his friend Captain Eben Pierce, and Eben Pierce suggested he come down here to work in some of the shipyards. So lying in the field over there was this falling apart old sloop, and Captain Pierce gave him that old sloop, the spray, and Slocum, board by board, rebuilt the whole thing. He launched it in 1892 right off of here, sailed around the harbor a couple of times, and then went to Boston for a year. Then he hit upon the idea that he was going to try to sail around the world. So in April of 1895, he set sail from Boston and spent the next 3 years sailing around the world. Slocum became the first man to sail alone around the world. Alice Cherry, I told you about, Captain Cherry. She, as a young girl, was going to go on a sailing excursion with Joshua Slocum. He invited a small party of young women to go sailing to a picnic in Marion. So they got on the spray, and they sailed, 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 and they ended up in Newport. A week or two later, Joshua Slocum said, "All right, you know what? We're going to try this again. Pack up your picnic baskets, girls. We're going to go have a picnic in Marion." They set sail. They were sailing and sailing and sailing and sailing and sailing and sailing. They ended up in Newport. So later on, Genevieve Darden She wrote for Yankee magazine. She interviewed Alice Cherry, who thought that Slocum really wasn't a very good navigator, and the theory developed that really he didn't intend to sail around the world. He was just trying to go to a picnic in Marion. So there's a lot of history stuff to see in town. Thank you all very much for coming. If you go to fairhaventours.com, you can find the other tours we do. Thank you.